And as you noted, our next speaker is Rob Califf. Dr. Califf is head of clinical policy and strategy for Verily and Google Health. He served as Deputy Commissioner for Medical Products and Tobacco in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration from 2015 to 2016, and also as Commissioner of Food and Drugs from 2016 to 2017. Dr. Califf?
Put on your seatbelts here because I'm going to go through a lot of slides. And as I expected, Peter did a great job of going through some of the details of regulation and the issues that are involved. I'm also enjoying the fact that in my life in Silicon Valley, I always come across as a curmudgeon because I'm always surrounded by highly optimistic people about the present and the future. Peter did a good job of being the curmudgeon, so I can be the optimistic person during this presentation. I'm going to try to give you a sense of the overall sort of view of the FDA as at least what I took away from it during a really privileged position of leading the FDA at the end of the Obama administration. These are the main points I'm going to make. The FDA's mission is to preserve and protect the public health, and the word health is really important, as Peter emphasized. This is a great time to talk about precision nutrition, and I think many people have made that point during the course of the meeting. But there are some warning signs. Right now, we have a deteriorating public health, demonstrably so. We've got tremendous advances in biology that sort of build a bridge towards the concept of health. And we're in this new period of explosion of knowledge, which leads to the real opportunity to be truthful, but not necessarily avoiding being misleading. And I would say that except in the cases of specific nutritional deficiency, individual biomarkers are highly unlikely to predict the effect of food on overall health. And then finally, as Peter really emphasized quite well, the pipeline of precision nutrition requires multiple levels of quality systems and validation, many of which don't exist for the reasons that he described. So first of all, just the big picture on the FDA. People think of it as a regulatory agency. It's certainly in the news a lot right now in the pandemic, but it's a science-based agency and recognized that way by the courts, and also has this mandate for public health, not just the regulation of the industry. And it was awesome to me to see the interplay of science, medicine, and public health, policy people, and law. As a practicing cardiologist, I had initially learned anytime you're dealing with a lawyer, it's not a good thing. But I learned a lot at the FDA about the way the law can be used to advance health, and really enjoyed those interactions. And it's also important as we talk about food to realize that an advantage of the FDA is that it's able to look across this whole span of products, not just food. And when I give a lecture about drugs, I say the same thing, that food is such a big part of the FDA, which most people who develop drugs don't think about. And so this just is a set of pictures. You don't think about the FDA very often in terms of animal health, but it's a critical agency there. And in this era of pandemics and One Health, a very important part of it. And of course, drugs, devices, biologics, and we can't forget about tobacco. And so when we talk about regulation of food, the principles that are learned in all these other areas turn out to be quite important, and many of them are transferable. And many of the arguments that I heard were that, quote, we're different, unquote, whereas most of the time I think the principles are really the same. If you're intervening on a human being, the net effects on health are either good or bad, and those are measurable. So then if we go right to the website, I've underlined some of the key elements from the website relevant to this discussion: protecting public health by assuring safety, efficacy, and security. And you notice the food supply there. I can't talk about anything at the FDA in a general sense without emphasizing tobacco, which is a special case of something that we ingest that has multiple constituents and broad effects. This part of helping the public get accurate science-based information, extraordinarily relevant to this discussion and so important in terms of some of the points that have been made about the difficulty of specific information relative to more concise, broad principles. And then counterterrorism, as it was broadly called, people were mystified when I used to emphasize this before the pandemic, but now I think a lot more people get the concept that the FDA has a very important mission to support the country in times of catastrophic events, whether it's would be a nuclear episode or a pandemic. And also, what's so important about the FDA relative to much of what has been discussed at this meeting is that the FDA actually has to make decisions. It can't just say more research is needed. This leads to a lot of public misunderstanding because let's say that it's a 60-40 probabilistic issue. At certain times, the FDA has to go with the 60%, even though there's a 40% chance that it's wrong. And I like to think about the main role of the FDA as like a referee in a sports event with guidance from the rule book, which comes from laws made by Congress, and then interpretation of those laws by the federal agency. And much like referees, the FDA loves it when someone does something really well. But when you violate the rules, it has a responsibility to do something about it. And of course, FDA decisions have a profound effect because we're talking about 20% of the economy. All right, now just a quick set of pictures to reinforce what I think many Americans have difficulty grasping. Out of the top 18 high-income countries, we are in last place in health outcomes. And I'm just going to use longevity as a measure, but if we took quality of life or functionality, it looks exactly the same. We're not only in last place, but we're losing ground compared to the competition. And during the pandemic, we've lost an enormous amount of ground in a setting in which we were already in last place, with a tremendous drop in life expectancy measured as a result of the pandemic, not just because of COVID, but the leading causes of death have not been COVID during the pandemic. They've been good old cancer and heart disease. And this was really exemplified in this diagram, which shows at the bottom the gap in life expectancy between the US and our peer countries in terms of being high-income countries. We're really not even in the same league. And you'll see now we're up to over a 4.5-year gap in life expectancy compared to other countries. So when you're a public health agency and you see this sort of picture, you'd better think carefully about what you're doing and see what can be done to reverse the situation. Now, Dr. Roberto made a really excellent point looking at cities that there are huge differences in life expectancy. So this is not a uniform issue. And in fact, if you look at coastal areas, big cities on average, and university towns, it looks more like Scandinavia. It's really rural America where the biggest drops in life expectancy are occurring over time. And it hasn't escaped anyone's notice that likely diet, in addition to many other factors, had something to do with that. And if we look at the analysis of the underlying cause in this work from IHME, what you see is that the social determinants are primary. And it's obvious to all of us that social determinants affect diet. And as we talk about precision nutrition, exactly what that means in terms of common factors that should lead to differences in diet versus very specific individualized diets is something I know you've all talked about. But if we look at the second tranche of factors, what's the biology underlying this? It's all the things we already know about: obesity, physical activity, cigarette smoking, hypertension, diabetes, all with a major role for diet in this. And then if we look at what's causing most of the deaths, it's good old-fashioned chronic bread and butter disease that we all recognize and might have thought that we had conquered. But in fact, it's critical for us to accept that we're going in the wrong direction right now. It's not just a matter of applying what we know to get better than we are. We're actually headed in the wrong direction. And if we look at what's underneath these diagnoses, these are things that are very much related to diet. And you see dietary risk as one of the most important factors. Okay, so this is kind of depressing, But to be the optimist in the room, we are in this new data environment, which has been emphasized, I noticed, all throughout this meeting. But it's not just the amount of data, it's also the fact that data is available in real time anywhere in the world with very little latency, and that we can apply analyses to this data even in streaming in real time. So the opportunity to intervene on people's cell phones is something that just didn't exist until very recently, and offers a tremendous opportunity for precision diet. Now, I just want to emphasize, just with some graphics, how much the world has changed, because we all live in it, we all know it, but we don't stop and think about it very often. It was only 20 years ago that the only way you could really find out about diet and medical issues was to either get a periodical in the mail or go to this thing called a library that many young people don't even recognize now, because they get their information on this instrument called the cell phone. And in fact, in low-income areas, there are many people, often with an equal number of cell phones to high-income areas. The way they're used is different, which is another topic. But just the volume of information that people can get in real time is enormous. And a statistic that's really sort of overwhelming is that if you look at downloads on YouTube, that is people looking at videos, mostly on their cell phones, related to COVID, 500 billion downloads since the start of the pandemic. So we are in an information-rich environment where this explosion of biology gives many opportunities to give either truthful or misleading information that's available in real time anywhere in the world. But it's not just the information, it's the ability to compute now. This old parable of the blind man and the elephant has really plagued us throughout the history of trying to understand therapeutic or health maintaining interventions in the human condition, because we can only look at one part of the story at the time. But this has really changed so that we can now, computation is not the limiting factor. We can now look at the entire human being, the way they interact, and the environment in which they exist. And just as one example, we've been working on this with a number of academic groups from my old home and my current affiliations. And the ability now to integrate all this information, which has been emphasized by others, is profound. It does raise a number of questions about how to regulate such a complex interplay of findings and claims that might be made. This is not just about the entire human being, but of course, as has been emphasized here, the ability to integrate information from the cell to the organ to the entire human being has come a long way. And I would maintain that despite the explosion of biological information, the fundamental issue is that this integration of all this information in a person or in a population results in an overall health effect, which can be measured by a rigorous method called the clinical trial. And I don't think it matters whether it's a drug, a device, or a food. The same principles hold. It's just a lot more difficult with food for reasons that all of you understand. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. I just want to thank Peter for going over this. I still, as a clinician, I just cannot understand for the life of me what a structure function claim actually means. And I worry that structure function claims lead people to buy products thinking that they're improving their health when there's absolutely no evidence that such is the case. And then finally, I want to just quickly go back to a committee that I was on over a decade ago and refer you back to that committee, because I think the findings of the committee were very true today. We had no idea that the computational capability and the ability to integrate genome and proteins and cells and tissues would be so profound, but I think the principles are the same. And a critical issue here is to understand that a biomarker of one measurement is not necessarily a surrogate. That is, a single measurement does not necessarily predict an overall health effect. In order to be a surrogate, to be an intermediate that tells you that there's going to be a positive or a negative health effect, a lot of research has to be done to validate that that's the case. And the vast majority of biomarkers, in fact, are not valid surrogates because they're existing in this complex systems environment that you've all been through, where if one thing improves, you may be making something else worse in the same system at the same time. What we really care about is the clinical endpoint. Is someone living longer, functioning better, or feeling better? These are the things that really matter, and we need to be cautious about taking these intermediate biomarkers and making claims that somehow we're affecting health in a predictable and reliable way. I'd refer you to this resource, which we developed when I was at the FDA, called the BEST resource, which goes over this in detail. I'm a little biased, but I think this should be required reading of anyone who works in this field. And then the last thing I want to do is just show you 3 diagrams that I think just tell the story in a way. This goes back over 30 years when this was first written about. But our brains tend to work in a way that says if we worried about a disease and we can measure something related to that disease, if we intervene, we can reliably affect the true clinical outcome if we change that measurement. Unfortunately, the body doesn't work that way. As you've gone over in detail over the last 2.5 days, there are many ways that an intervention can affect either the outcome of interest or the biomarker of interest or some other biological process that we never imagined. And as you can probably tell, my great hope is that now, because we can compute systems biology, there's an opportunity to understand this complex multidimensional interplay in a way that was just entirely impossible before. It led to a lot of harm because we had therapies that we thought were beneficial because, for example, they lowered the LDL cholesterol. And then we found there was a countervening effect of the same therapy that we hadn't anticipated and didn't measure. And I would argue that food is the ultimate example of this complexity. And we thought about this a lot in this Institute of Medicine committee over a decade ago. You're giving a lot of different stuff at the same time, each affecting multiple pathways, each with a complex and interactive impact on overall health. And so to get this right, we got to go back to using the biology as a stepping stone, but then actually doing the validation of the measurements, as Peter emphasized, qualifying through the basis of evidence, and then looking at what happens when we apply in practice. And I'll just close with this summary that if we don't go through this process and through the scientific regulatory process, we don't get this right, we could do a lot of harm with our recommendations and never know it until many years later. So I hope this is helpful, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob.